My son, Daniel, a boy I'd raised with every ounce of love and sacrifice a mother could muster, a boy whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose teenage heartbreaks I'd mended with patient words and warm cocoa, had become a stranger in his own life, a puppet dancing to the strings of his new wife, Clara. She, with her perfectly coiffed hair, her dismissive smiles, and her uncanny ability to twist every situation to her advantage, had systematically, insidiously, driven a wedge between us, turning Daniel against the very woman who had given him life. He took her side in every argument, every disagreement, no matter how trivial, no matter how blatantly she was in the wrong. My opinions were old-fashioned, my concerns overbearing, my presence, it seemed, an unwelcome anachronism in their sleek, modern, Clara-centric world. I was relegated to the sidelines, a forgotten relic, my heart aching with a silent, unacknowledged grief. Then came the ultimatum. The moment Clara, in her infinite arrogance, believed she had finally cornered him, forced him to make the ultimate, irrevocable choice, her, or me. She thought she had won. She thought Daniel, so thoroughly under her spell, would cast me aside without a second thought. She didn't know Daniel. Or perhaps, she didn't know the enduring, resilient power of a mother's love, a love that even years of neglect and disrespect couldn't entirely extinguish. And she certainly didn't understand that sometimes, the quietest, most browbeaten individuals, when pushed to the absolute brink, can find a strength they never knew they possessed. The choice Daniel made that day didn't just surprise Clara, it shattered her carefully constructed world, and in doing so, it began to mend the broken pieces of mine. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The shift in Daniel was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow turning of a tide. Before Clara, he was my boy, thoughtful, affectionate, always ready with a hug or a helping hand. We had our rituals, Sunday dinners, shared laughter over old family movies, long talks on the porch swing where I'd offer advice, and he, surprisingly often, would listen. He was a good son, a kind man. Then Clara entered his life, a whirlwind of ambition, sophistication, and a steely determination that brooked no opposition. She was beautiful, I couldn't deny that, with a sharp intelligence and a successful career in marketing. But there was a hardness about her, a calculating glint in her eyes that made me uneasy from the start. Daniel, however, was utterly captivated. He saw her as his equal, his partner in building a power couple future. I tried to be welcoming, to embrace her for his sake. I invited them for dinners, baked her favorite lemon tart, listened politely as she talked about her demanding job, her high-powered colleagues, her plans for their inevitably glamorous future. But my efforts were met with a cool, appraising politeness that never quite warmed into genuine affection. Clara, it soon became clear, saw me not as a mother-in-law to be cherished, or even respected, but as an obstacle, a relic of Daniel's simpler past, to be managed, minimized, and eventually, if possible, erased. The first sign of trouble came with the wedding plans. Clara, with her impeccable taste and even more impeccable disdain for anything she considered common, vetoed every suggestion I made. My offer to help with the invitations, using my calligraphy skills, was met with a tight smile and "Oh, that's sweet, Eleanor, but we're using a professional designer. It's all very minimalist, very chic." My treasured family lace, which I'd hoped she might incorporate into her gown, was deemed too fussy, too old-fashioned. I was relegated to the role of a bewildered, increasingly marginalized, spectator at my own son's wedding. After they were married, the distancing accelerated. Daniel, who used to call me several times a week, now barely managed a hurried, perfunctory call on Sundays, his conversation punctuated by Clara's whispered prompts in the background. Visits to their sleek, modern apartment, a far cry from the cozy, slightly cluttered home he'd grown up in, were infrequent and always felt strained. Clara would play the gracious hostess, offering me lukewarm tea in a cup without a saucer, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, while Daniel fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable, torn between his wife's unspoken disapproval and his mother's equally unspoken hurt. The arguments, when they began, were always instigated by Clara, usually over some perceived slight on my part, some innocent comment misinterpreted, some boundary unknowingly crossed. I might mention an old family tradition, Clara would declare it outdated. I might offer a piece of unsolicited but well-intentioned advice, she would accuse me of interfering. And Daniel, my Daniel, would invariably, inevitably, take her side. "Mom, Clara's right," he'd say, his voice tinged with a weary resignation. "You have to understand, things are different now. We have our own way of doing things." My heart would clench with each betrayal, each casual dismissal of my feelings, my experience, my love. I was being systematically edged out, my role in his life shrinking with every passing day, every cutting remark from Clara, every weak defense from my son. The loneliness was a constant ache, a hollow space where a vibrant, loving relationship had once been. I mourned the son I was losing, the closeness we had shared, the future I had envisioned, a future where I would be a cherished grandmother, a welcome presence in their lives. Instead, I was becoming a ghost, a faded photograph in an album they rarely bothered to open. The pattern of Daniel siding with Clara, regardless of the context or the inherent unfairness of her position, became a deeply ingrained, soul-crushing aspect of our interactions. It was as if he had willingly donned a pair of Clara-colored glasses, through which all my actions, my words, my very intentions, were distorted and viewed with suspicion. If I offered to babysit their hypothetical future children, a topic Clara would only discuss in the most abstract, distant terms, as if procreation were a business merger, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, Eleanor, that's sweet, but childcare standards are so different now. We'd want someone with early childhood development certifications, of course." And Daniel would nod sagely, "She's right, Mom. It's a different world." If I baked Daniel's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the ones he'd devoured by the dozen as a boy, Clara would wrinkle her nose and remark, "So much sugar, Daniel. We're trying to be healthier, remember?" And Daniel, after a moment's guilty hesitation, would push the plate away. "Yeah, Mom, maybe just one. Clara's got me on this new wellness kick." My internal monologue during these encounters was a tempest of frustration, disbelief, and a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight. Had he forgotten everything? The years I'd spent nurturing him, supporting him, cheering him on? Did my lifetime of love and experience count for nothing against Clara's pronouncements, her ever-shifting, self-serving rules of engagement? The most painful incidents were often the most trivial, the ones that highlighted the sheer pettiness of Clara's campaign to diminish me in Daniel's eyes. There was the incident of the family photograph album, the one I'd painstakingly compiled over decades, a treasure trove of memories. I'd brought it over one Sunday, hoping to share some old stories, to perhaps rekindle a spark of our former closeness. Clara had flipped through it with a bored air, her only comment, "Goodness, the hairstyles were truly tragic back then, weren't they?" When I'd pointed out a picture of Daniel as a toddler, beaming proudly on his first tricycle, a tricycle his father had lovingly restored for him, Clara had merely smirked. "He looks rather like a startled hamster, doesn't he?" Daniel, instead of defending his childhood self, or the memory of his father, had just chuckled weakly and changed the subject. The album was quickly put away, relegated to a dusty shelf, another piece of my history, our history, deemed irrelevant, embarrassing. Then there was the matter of Sunday dinners. For years, even after Daniel had moved out on his own, Sunday dinner at my house had been a sacrosanct tradition. It was a time for connection, for catching up, for simply being family. After Clara, the dinners became less frequent, then sporadic, then almost non-existent. When I'd gently inquire, Daniel would offer a litany of excuses, usually involving Clara's demanding work schedule, or their need for downtime after a stressful week. One Sunday, after weeks of cancellations, I'd called, my voice perhaps a little too hopeful. "Just a simple roast chicken, Daniel," I'd said. "Your favorite. No fuss." There was a pause, then Clara's voice, cool and clear, in the background. "Tell her we have plans, Daniel. A new restaurant opening. Very exclusive." And Daniel, his voice apologetic but firm, had relayed the message. "Sorry, Mom. Maybe next week." Next week, of course, never came. It was a slow, painful starvation of affection, of connection, of belonging. I felt like a plant being deprived of sunlight, slowly wilting, my colors fading. I tried to talk to Daniel, to express my hurt, my confusion. But Clara was always there, a gatekeeper, a censor, her presence a constant reminder of my diminished status. "Mom, you're being oversensitive," Daniel would say, his eyes pleading with me to just accept. "Clara doesn't mean anything by it. She's just direct." Direct? Or deliberately cruel? I knew the answer, even if Daniel refused to see it. My friends, my sister, they saw it. "He's completely under her thumb," Eleanor, my sister, Mary, had said, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and exasperation. "You need to stand up to her, to him." But how? How do you stand up to a fog, to a subtle, insidious campaign of marginalization? How do you fight for a son who seems to willingly, almost eagerly, embrace his own captivity? I retreated further into myself, my heart a landscape of quiet grief. The vibrant, engaged mother I had once been was slowly being replaced by a hesitant, anodyne version, afraid to speak her mind, afraid to offer an opinion, lest it be twisted, criticized, used as further ammunition in Clara's relentless war of attrition. I was losing my son, one conceited argument, one broken tradition, one unanswered phone call at a time. And the most painful part was that he didn't even seem to notice, or care, that he was the one handing Clara the knife. The breaking point, the moment the slow, agonizing erosion of my relationship with Daniel finally reached its bedrock, arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It concerned the upcoming christening of their first child, my granddaughter, Lily. The news of Clara's pregnancy had been delivered with a carefully orchestrated casualness, almost as an afterthought during one of their rare, brief visits. My initial surge of joy, the instinctive grandmotherly thrill, had been quickly tempered by a familiar sense of foreboding. Would I even be allowed to be a grandmother in anything more than name only? The christening, Clara announced, was to be a small, intimate affair, held at the very exclusive, very modern chapel attached to David's, now Daniel's, through marriage, family's country club. The guest list, she'd implied, was very select. I, of course, assumed I would be included. I was, after all, the baby's grandmother. I had already started knitting a delicate, heirloom-quality christening gown, a tradition in our family for generations. I'd envisioned Lily, tiny and precious, wrapped in the soft, lacy wool, a tangible link to her heritage, to the women who had come before her. When I mentioned the gown to Clara, during a stilted phone call, her response was dismissive. "Oh, Eleanor, that's thoughtful. But we've already picked out an outfit for Lily. A little designer piece. Very simple, very elegant. You're knitting, it's lovely, of course, but perhaps a bit too traditional for the look we're going for." Too traditional. Like me. Like everything I represented. The unspoken message was deafening. The invitation, when it finally arrived, was addressed to Eleanor Vance. Not Mom, not Grandma. Just my formal name, as if I were a distant business acquaintance. And tucked inside, along with the stiff, cream-colored card, was a smaller, separate slip of paper, printed in an elegant, impersonal font. It read, "Due to limited space and the intimate nature of the reception, we kindly request that only those named on the invitation attend the post-ceremony luncheon." I stared at the slip of paper, my blood turning to ice. I was invited to the ceremony, yes. A public display of familial unity, perhaps. But not to the luncheon. Not to the celebration. I was to witness the sacrament, then discreetly disappear, my traditional presence no longer required once the formalities were over. The cruelty of it, the calculated, public snub, was breathtaking. This wasn't just about a meal, it was about a clear, unambiguous statement of my exclusion, my irrelevance. I confronted Daniel, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and a cold, simmering anger I hadn't felt in years. "Daniel," I said, the offending slip of paper clutched in my hand, "what is the meaning of this?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable, his gaze shifting nervously towards Clara, who stood beside him, her expression a mask of serene, unbothered innocence. "Mom," he began, his voice low, apologetic, "it's just space. The private dining room at the club, it's not very large. And Clara has so many friends, colleagues. So many friends and colleagues who take precedence over your own mother? Over Lily's grandmother? I pressed, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. Clara stepped forward then, her smile tight, condescending. Eleanor, she said, her tone honeyed but laced with steel, we really don't want any unpleasantness on Lily's special day. It's about her, not about old grievances. Old grievances. As if my pain, my legitimate hurt, were nothing more than a petty, ancient squabble. That was when the dam finally broke. Old grievances, Clara? I cried, my voice shaking with a fury I could no longer contain. You have systematically, deliberately, pushed me out of my son's life, out of my granddaughter's life. You have treated me with contempt, with disrespect, with a callous indifference that has broken my heart 1,000 times over. And now you expect me to attend this charade, this public performance of a happy family, only to be dismissed like an unwanted servant once the curtain falls? Is that what you expect? Daniel looked horrified, his face pale. Clara's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Mother, Daniel began, his voice pleading, please, don't do this. Not now. Don't do what, Daniel? I demanded. Don't speak the truth? Don't stand up for myself after years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family? Clara stepped between us, her eyes blazing. That's enough, Eleanor, she snapped. You are upsetting Daniel. You are ruining what should be a joyous occasion. If you can't be supportive, if you can't be appropriate, then perhaps it's best you don't come at all. The words hung in the air, ugly, irrevocable. Daniel stood frozen, his face a mask of anguish, torn, as always, between his wife and his mother. Daniel? I whispered, my gaze fixed on him, my heart aching with a desperate, final plea. Are you going to let her speak to me this way? Are you going to let her uninvite me from my own granddaughter's christening? He looked from Clara's furious face to my tear-streaked one, his expression tormented. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And then, he spoke, his voice barely audible, the words of death knell to the last vestiges of my hope. Mom, he said, his eyes not meeting mine, maybe Clara's right. Maybe it would be less stressful for everyone, if you didn't come. Less stressful for everyone. Except me. The betrayal, so complete, so absolute, sucked the air from my lungs. I stared at him, at the son I had loved, the son I had lost, and a cold, profound despair settled over me. This was it. The final severance. Clara had won. Or so she thought. The days following that devastating confrontation were a blur of numb disbelief and a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. I didn't go to the christening. The thought of witnessing that charade, of playing the part of the politely tolerated, then summarily dismissed, grandmother, was unbearable. The little white christening gown, the one I'd knitted with such love and anticipation, lay folded in a drawer, a poignant symbol of a connection that would never be. I received no calls, no apologies, no conciliatory gestures from Daniel or Clara. Just a heavy, suffocating silence, a silence that confirmed my utter irrelevance in their carefully curated world. My sister, Mary, was incandescent with rage on my behalf. That woman is a viper, Eleanor, she'd fumed over the phone. And Daniel. Daniel is a spineless fool. How could he let her do this to you? Her anger, while validating, offered little comfort. It couldn't mend the broken pieces of my heart, couldn't bridge the chasm that now seemed to yawn, vast and uncrossable, between me and my son. It was during this period of profound desolation that a small, unexpected flicker of defiance began to stir within me. I had been a good mother. I had been a loving, devoted presence in Daniel's life for over 30 years. I had done nothing to deserve this cruel, systematic erasure. And I would not, I decided with a sudden, fierce clarity, allow Clara's narrative, the narrative of me as an overbearing, old-fashioned, irrelevant old woman, to be the final word on my life, my legacy. My mind turned to my will. It was a simple document, drafted years ago when Daniel was still in college, leaving everything, my modest home, my small savings, to him, my only child. The thought of Clara, and by extension, Daniel, benefiting from my lifetime of hard work, after such profound, calculated disrespect, now felt like an intolerable injustice. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. My legacy, I decided, would not be a reward for cruelty. It would be a testament to my own worth, a final, indelible statement. I contacted my solicitor, Mr. Henderson, a kind, elderly gentleman who had handled my late husband's affairs with quiet competence. I explained the situation, my voice surprisingly steady as I recounted the years of subtle dismissals, culminating in the christening debacle. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, his expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, he adjusted his spectacles and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle, "you have every right to dispose of your assets as you see fit. This is a deeply personal decision, and one that should reflect your own wishes, your own values." We discussed my options. I had no other close relatives. Mary, my sister, was comfortably well off. My thoughts turned to St. Jude's Children's Hospital, a charity my late husband and I had always supported, a place that embodied the compassion and care so glaringly absent in my recent familial interactions. The decision, once made, felt right. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way of reclaiming some measure of control over my own narrative, my own final chapter. Mr. Henderson drafted the new will with his customary efficiency. The act of signing it, of formally disinheriting my only child, was not without a pang of residual sorrow. But it was overshadowed by a sense of profound, almost serene, resolution. My legacy would now be one of generosity, of compassion, directed towards those who truly needed it, those who embodied the values I held dear. It was a small, private act, but it felt momentous. It was my declaration of independence, my refusal to be defined by their cruelty, my quiet insistence on my own enduring worth. I didn't tell Daniel or Clara about the change. There was no need. They had made their choices. I had made mine. The true impact of my decision, I knew, would only be felt much later, at a time when they might finally, perhaps, be capable of understanding the true cost of their actions. But for now, a small measure of peace settled over me. I had taken back my power, in the only way left open to me. And in doing so, I had begun, slowly, tentatively, to reclaim myself. Life settled into a new, albeit lonelier, rhythm. The silence from Daniel and Clara was absolute. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them, a ghost in their carefully constructed, motherless world. I focused on my small joys, my garden, my books, my correspondence with old friends, the weekly visits from Mary, whose unwavering support was a lifeline. The pain of Daniel's estrangement was a constant, dull ache, a wound that refused to fully heal. But the anger, the raw despair, had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, almost stoic, acceptance. I had made my peace with the situation, or so I thought. About a year after the christening debacle, an unexpected event occurred that threatened to shatter my fragile equilibrium. Daniel called. His voice, when I answered, was strained, almost unrecognizable. "Mom," he began, his tone hesitant, unfamiliar. It's Daniel." My heart leaped, a foolish, maternal flutter of hope. Had he come to his senses? Was this the apology, the reconciliation I had secretly, despite everything, still yearned for? "Daniel," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "What is it?" It's Clara, Mom," he stammered. She's left me." The words hung in the air, stunning me into silence. Clara? Left him? It was inconceivable. Theirs had been the perfect marriage, the power couple, the united front against which I had so consistently, so painfully, crumbled. She said she needed more," Daniel continued, his voice cracking. "More excitement, more ambition. She said I was holding her back. That I was too much like you, too focused on sentimentality, on the past." The irony was so bitter, it almost made me laugh. I, the old-fashioned, sentimental mother, was now, apparently, the reason for his marital demise. She met someone else, Mom, he choked out. Someone more successful. More like her. She packed her bags this morning. Took Lily. Just left. He was crying now, deep, shuddering sobs, the sound of a man whose world had just imploded. And in that moment, despite everything, despite the years of hurt, of neglect, of betrayal, my heart went out to him. He was still my son, my boy, and he was in pain. "Oh, Daniel," I said, my voice soft with a complex mixture of emotions, pity, a strange, unwelcome flicker of vindication, and an overwhelming, instinctive maternal urge to comfort. I'm so sorry." We talked for a long time that day, longer than we had spoken in years. He poured out his hurt, his confusion, his anger at Clara, his dawning, painful realization of her true character, her ruthless ambition, her emotional manipulations. He didn't explicitly apologize for his own behavior towards me, not then. He was too consumed by his own grief. But in his brokenness, in his vulnerability, I saw a glimmer of the son I had once known, the boy who had once looked to me for comfort, for guidance. The conversation ended with no easy resolutions, no promises of a miraculous reconciliation. But a door I thought had been irrevocably, brutally, slammed shut, had creaked open, just a fraction. The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in the fog of years of accumulated pain. But for the first time in a very long time, a tiny, fragile seed of hope, a hope I hadn't dared to nurture, began to tentatively, cautiously, unfurl within my weary heart. The choice he had been forced to make, the choice between Clara and her ambition, or a life that perhaps held space for something more, something truer, had been made for him, by her. And in the wreckage of his perfect life, perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for him to find his way back, not just to me, but to himself. The weeks following Clara's abrupt departure were a period of tentative, almost hesitant, reconnection between Daniel and me. He called more frequently, his voice often still raw with pain and disbelief, but also with a dawning clarity about the woman he had married, the woman who had so thoroughly dominated his life, and, in doing so, nearly destroyed his relationship with his own mother. He didn't make excuses for Clara anymore. He spoke of her ambition, her materialism, her emotional unavailability, with a newfound, if painful, understanding. He talked about Lily, his voice filled with a father's aching love and the fear of losing her in the impending custody battle Clara was already threatening. He didn't explicitly apologize for his own past behavior towards me, not yet. I sensed he wasn't ready for that his own grief and anger were still too raw, too overwhelming. But there was a new humility in his tone, a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. He asked for my advice, tentatively at first, then with increasing frequency. About lawyers, about coping with Clara's manipulative tactics, about how to be a good father to Lily amidst the turmoil. I listened patiently, offering what comfort and practical wisdom I could, careful not to say "I told you so," careful not to rub salt in his already gaping wounds. It was a delicate dance, this rebuilding of a shattered bond. One afternoon, he appeared at my doorstep, unannounced. He looked diminished. Thinner, his eyes shadowed, the confident swagger Clara had instilled in him replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He was holding a small, slightly battered-looking teddy bear. This was Lily's favorite," he said, his voice thick. "She left it behind. I thought maybe you could fix it? The seam on its arm is coming undone." I took the bear from him, its plush fur matted with what looked like tear stains. It was a simple repair, one I could do in my sleep. But the gesture, his coming to me, his mother, for help, for comfort, for a small act of mending, it spoke volumes. We sat in my kitchen, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, and as I carefully stitched the bear's arm, Daniel talked. He talked about his marriage, about Clara's subtle manipulations, her constant criticisms, her relentless drive for more money, more status, more control. He talked about how he had slowly, almost imperceptibly, allowed her to isolate him from his old friends, from his family, from himself. "I became someone I didn't even recognize, Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. someone she wanted me to be. And I was so afraid of losing her, of not measuring up, that I went along with it. Even when it meant hurting you. There it was. The first, tentative acknowledgement of his own culpability. I continued stitching, my silence an invitation for him to continue. The christening, Mom, he said, his voice cracking. Lily's christening. What I did to you, what I allowed Clara to do, there's no excuse for it. I was a coward. I chose her demands, over my own mother. And I've regretted it every single day since she walked out. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a raw, painful remorse. Can you ever forgive me, Mom? I set down the mended bear, its arm now whole, its button eye seeming to gaze up at me with a newfound hope. I looked at my son, my Daniel, no longer the confident, Clara-controlled man, but the broken, vulnerable boy I had once known. The years of accumulated hurt, of anger, of disappointment, they were still there, a heavy weight in my heart. But beneath them, the deep, abiding well of a mother's love, a love I thought had run dry, began to stir. Forgiveness, Daniel, I said, my voice soft, is a long road. For both of us. But perhaps we can start walking it together. His face crumpled, and he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch, so long absent, so desperately missed, was a balm to my weary soul. The mending had begun, not just of a child's forgotten toy, but of a mother's broken heart, and a son's lost way. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it felt illuminated, not by the harsh glare of Clara's ambition, but by the soft, gentle glow of a rekindled, albeit fragile, hope. The mending of our relationship, like the mending of Lily's teddy bear, was a slow, painstaking process, requiring patience, honesty, and a willingness from both of us to confront the painful truths of the past. Daniel started visiting more regularly, not out of obligation, but, it seemed, out of a genuine desire for connection. He'd bring groceries, offer to fix things around the house, small, tangible acts of repentance that spoke louder than any grand apology. We talked for hours, revisiting old memories, both good and bad. He spoke of his childhood with a nostalgia that surprised me, remembering small, forgotten moments of shared laughter, of quiet comfort. He also spoke of his regrets, his voice often thick with a shame that was clearly genuine. He acknowledged the ways he had allowed Clara to manipulate him, to isolate him from me, to disrespect the values he had been raised with. I was so focused on building this perfect life with her, Mom, he admitted one evening, as we sat on the porch swing, the twilight deepening around us, that I completely lost sight of what truly mattered. I traded authenticity for ambition, substance for style. And in the end, I lost everything, except, perhaps, a chance to find my way back to what's real. His custody battle with Clara for Lily was acrimonious and protracted. Clara, true to form, fought dirty, making outrageous demands, attempting to paint Daniel as an unfit father. But Daniel, with a newfound resolve I hadn't seen in him for years, stood his ground. He fought for his daughter with a quiet determination, his love for her a powerful, unwavering force. I supported him in any way I could, offering a listening ear, a comforting presence, and, when he asked, my perspective on Clara's tactics, having experienced her manipulations firsthand for so long. One of the most significant steps in our reconciliation came when Daniel asked if he could bring Lily to visit me. He had partial custody now, every other weekend. My heart leaped at the prospect. Of course, Daniel, I said, trying to keep the tremor of emotion out of my voice. I would love that more than anything. Meeting Lily, truly meeting her, not as a distant, unacknowledged grandmother, but as Grandma Eleanor, was a moment I will cherish for the rest of my days. She was a bright, curious little girl, with Daniel's kind eyes and a mischievous smile that reminded me so much of him as a child. She was shy at first, clinging to Daniel's leg, but I had come prepared. I brought out the old, slightly battered wooden train set that had been Daniel's favorite, the one his grandfather had made for him. Her eyes lit up. We spent the afternoon on the floor, pushing the little wooden engine along its tracks, building imaginary towns, our laughter filling the small living room, chasing away the lingering ghosts of past sorrows. Daniel watched us, his expression a mixture of joy and a quiet, profound sadness for the years that had been lost, the connections that had been so needlessly, so cruelly, severed by Clara's ambition. As they were leaving, Lily, unprompted, ran back and threw her arms around my legs in a fierce hug. "Bye, Grandma," she chirped. "Can we come back soon?" "Anytime, my darling," I whispered, my eyes stinging. "Anytime." The question of my will, the one that so decisively excluded Daniel, hung unspoken between us for a long time. I knew he was aware of it. Clara, in her bitterness, would undoubtedly have informed him of my decision. But he never mentioned it, never asked, never hinted at any expectation of a change. His efforts to reconnect, to rebuild our relationship, seemed genuine, untainted by any ulterior financial motive. It was this, more than anything, that began to soften the hard edges of my resolve. He was trying. He was learning. He was, perhaps, becoming the son I had always hoped he would be, the man his father would have been proud of. The old pain was still there, a scar that would always remain. But new layers of love, of forgiveness, of a hard-won, fragile hope, were slowly, carefully, being woven over it. The choice, the one Clara had so arrogantly forced upon him, had, in a strange, circuitous way, led him back home. The final, and perhaps most healing, chapter of this long, painful saga began with a quiet conversation on a cool autumn afternoon, about 18 months after Clara's departure. Daniel and Lily were regular visitors now, their presence a warm, comforting rhythm in my life. We had fallen into an easy companionship, the old wounds, though not forgotten, no longer a gaping chasm between us. We were sitting on my porch, sipping lemonade, watching Lily chase squirrels in the small garden, her laughter like wind chimes in the crisp air. Daniel had been unusually quiet, a thoughtful expression on his face. Finally, he turned to me. "Mom," he began, his voice low, serious, "there's something I need to say. Something I should have said a long time ago." I waited, my heart giving a small, expectant flutter. "I am so sorry," he said, his gaze direct, unwavering, his eyes filled with a profound, unmistakable remorse. "For everything. For the years I let Clara disrespect you, for the times I chose her side, for the pain I caused you, for not being the son you deserved. There's no excuse for my weakness, for my blindness. I was a fool, Mom. A selfish, arrogant fool. And I broke your heart. And mine." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I know an apology doesn't change anything. It doesn't undo the hurt. But I need you to know. I truly, deeply, regret it all. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you, if you'll let me." Tears welled in my eyes, tears not of sadness this time, but of a deep, cleansing release. His words, so long hoped for, so desperately needed, were a balm to my weary soul. "Oh, Daniel," I whispered, reaching for his hand. "Thank you. That means more to me than you can possibly know." We sat in silence for a while, his hand clutching mine, the unspoken weight of years of pain slowly, gently, beginning to lift. Later that week, I called Mr. Henderson. "I need to make another change to my will, Charles," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. The new will, the final will, was still primarily directed towards St. Jude's and the hospice, the charities that had held such meaning for Samuel and me. But there was a new clause. A significant portion, including the proceeds from the sale of my house upon my passing, was now to be placed in a trust, not just for Lily, but for Daniel as well. Not as an entitlement, not as a reward for past behavior, but as a gesture of forgiveness, of a mother's enduring, unconditional, if sometimes sorely tested, love. It was a recognition of his journey, of his hard-won understanding, of the man he was finally, painstakingly, becoming again. Clara, I heard, eventually remarried, to an older, wealthier man. Her pursuit of ambition, of status, continued, though I doubted it would ever bring her true happiness. That was her path to walk. Daniel, on the other hand, found a different kind of contentment. He focused on Lily, on rebuilding his career with a new humility and integrity, and on nurturing the rekindled bond with his mother. He never again took my love, my presence, for granted. Our Sunday dinners, once a source of such pain and exclusion, were reinstated, filled now with Lily's cheerful chatter, Daniel's easy laughter, and my own quiet, profound joy. The scars remained, of course. Some wounds, I knew, would never fully fade. But they no longer defined us. We had navigated the storm, weathered the betrayal, and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and, most importantly, together. The choice Clara had forced upon Daniel, the choice between her and me, had ultimately led him back to a truth he had forgotten, that a mother's love, however strained, however tested, is a powerful, resilient, and, in the end, an irreplaceable anchor in the often turbulent sea of life. And that, I realized, was a legacy far more valuable than any material inheritance. It was a legacy of forgiveness, of redemption, of the enduring, unconquerable power of love itself.